I want to start by playing something for you that I'm sure you've heard many times before, though maybe not recently. Here's how it goes. Now, in our musical tradition, we tend to prefer music in which, in addition to a melody, like the tune to Mary Had a Little Lamb, there's also some kind of harmony. So let's add some. Now, here we have a kind of division of labor between two different elements of the music. We have the melody, often also called the lead because it's out in front, foregrounded in the spotlight, and the accompaniment in the background. This is how things commonly work, for example, in a guitar band, where one guitar takes the lead and another, commonly called the rhythm guitar, takes a supporting role, filling in the harmony and helping keep the beat with additional support from the bass. But not all music works this way. Suppose that instead of having just one melody line with harmonic support in the background, we have two or more melody lines going at once, and the harmony comes from the way in which they interact. Now, this may sound very exotic, but it isn't really, because it's what happens in a kind of song with which I'm sure you're familiar, what music theorists call a circular canon, more commonly called a round. What happens when you sing a round? Well, one person starts off with the tune, and then a little later, a second person comes in with the part of the tune that the first person just finished singing and shadows the first person by always singing exactly what the first person sang, only a little bit later. Now, I can't sing a round all by myself, but because I have two hands, I can play one on the keyboard, like this. And so on. Now here I'm using my right hand for the part sung by the first voice and my left for the part sung by the second. And notice that it doesn't make any sense to say that I'm playing melody with one hand and accompaniment with the other, since both hands are doing the melody. And the harmony comes from the fact that most of the time, at each moment, they're playing different things because of the staggering of the parts apportioned to them. Now, whenever you do something like this, have two or more melody lines going at once, and you're getting the harmony from that, you're producing something called polyphony, aka counterpoint. And if you've ever sung a round, which I bet you have many times, then that's what you've been doing even if you've never heard those words before. You're kind of like the character in the play The Would-Be Gentleman by the French dramatist Molière, when he makes the amazing discovery that all his life he's been speaking in prose and never known it. Well, every time you sing Three Blind Mice or Frère Jacques or Row, Row, Row Your Boat, you're producing counterpoint, even if you never knew that before. Counterpoint is based on two main ideas. There's what's called a canon, which is what happens in a round. A melody starts, and then a little later someone starts it again, following exactly what the first person was doing, just a little bit behind. And then there's something that's called a quodlibet, in which you take two or more different melodies and do them together. For example, suppose that I play Frère Jacques with my right hand and Three Blind Mice with my left, like this. That's a quodlibet, two different tunes, one on top of the other. Now, as you may know, the greatest master of counterpoint in the world of classical music was Bach. Here's a composition of his, the eighth of a group of 15 short pieces that have come to be known as the two-part inventions. The most obvious thing about this piece is that it's very active. Both hands are kept busy throughout. Bach meant these pieces to help young players develop complete parity of the hands by requiring that anything done with one hand also be done with the other. But he also meant them as models of composition, and he absolutely succeeded in that aim. Even seasoned players go back to these little gems from time to time for the many pleasures that they afford. Now, why the name two-part inventions? Well, we don't know why Bach chose the label invention. He seems to have just, invented it specifically for this group of pieces, and he left no explanation of why he picked it, nor did he ever use it again. So what does the two-part mean? Well, first of all, Bach just called these pieces inventions. The two-part is an add-on that came later, though it does tell us something about the music. The word part in this connection is used as it is when we talk about, say, the soprano part of a choral work, or the alto part, or the tenor part, or whatever. So if you were going to sing any of the two-part inventions, you'd need two singers, or groups of singers, one to sing the high part, the one played by the right hand, and one to sing the low part, played by the left hand. But you wouldn't need any more than that. In other words, the two-part inventions are so called because they're studies in two-part counterpoint. In fact, everything we've heard so far has been two-part counterpoint. But there's also three-part counterpoint, four-part counterpoint, even five- and six-part counterpoint. But all the central ideas of counterpoint can be found in music with just two parts. So let me come back to our two-part invention and say a little bit more about what the counterpoint in it involves. There are two basic ingredients, the first of which is heard right at the beginning all by itself in the first 6 notes. That's then followed by a series of faster notes. The whole piece is built on just these two elements, the slower and the faster notes, and both hands have to be able to do the faster notes as well as the slower ones. Now, if you listen to the very beginning, you'll hear something that sounds a lot like the start of a round. In other words, at the beginning, we have a canon, though the piece as a whole eventually departs from the canon principle. The next thing I want to point out is that in counterpoint, the way in which the different parts move relative to each other is very important. There are 3 different kinds of relative motion. In similar motion, the parts move in the same direction. They both go up or both go down. And here's a place in the piece where that happens. But the parts can also move in opposite directions, which is called contrary motion. And here's a place where that happens. In this example, the two parts are moving toward each other. But you can also have parts in contrary motion moving away from each other, which is what happens right after the bit I just played. And then you can also have what's called oblique motion, in which one of the parts runs in place, as it were, while the other moves either toward it or away from it. And here's an example of that. The effect that all this creates, if the music is fast, as it is in this piece, is very much like that of a chase scene in one of those old silent movies. Just as in those scenes, people are constantly running toward each other, away from each other, around each other, going every which way, the parts in a piece of counterpoint are doing something very similar. And this leads to rises and falls of tension as the music unfolds, which is how it holds the interest of the listener. Contrary motion has the highest degree of tension associated with it, and oblique motion the next highest. Periods of similar motion can then be used to ease the tension created by the other two. So listen to the piece one more time in the light of what we've just learned. Now, the summit of the art of counterpoint is represented by the kind of composition called a fugue. So what is a fugue? Well, I could give you a definition, but it probably wouldn't mean much to you. It's better to give examples and explain as we go, so that's what I'm going to do. The examples I'm going to use come from a monumental cycle of paired preludes and fugues by Bach in all the 24 major and minor keys that goes by the curious title, The Well-Tempered Clavier. Clavier is just an old word meaning keyboard instrument, and the well-tempered part doesn't have anything to do with being in a pleasant mood, but with a way of tuning keyboard instruments that makes it possible to play in any key without retuning. This is not nearly as simple a matter as it sounds, but it doesn't have anything to do with counterpoint, so let's leave that matter there. In a fugue, there are typically at least 3 parts, though there are often more and very occasionally only 2. In the first one I'm going to do for you, there are 3. The parts are often also called voices, even in music for instruments, reflecting the fact that in Bach's time, all music, even if it didn't involve singing, took vocal music as a model. You'll normally start a fugue with a single voice which introduces a theme called the subject of the fugue. So here's how our example starts. Now, once you've introduced the subject, you bring the other voices in one by one, each restating the subject. If the second voice is above the first, then it comes in a fifth above the first one. And if it's below the first, then it comes in a fourth below. In this case, the second voice is above the first one, so it comes in on the fifth. We start here, but the second voice is going to come in up here. But the original voice also has to have something to do, so it gets a new theme called a countersubject, so called because it's played or sung against the subject. Here it is by itself. Notice that this has something of the character that we heard in the 2-part invention from earlier, consisting of a series of faster notes and a series of slower ones. Now, here are the subject and the countersubject together. Next comes something called an episode, a stretch of music between occurrences of the subject. This one gets us back to the original key from the one we changed to when the second voice came in. Now finally, the third voice makes its entrance way down here in the original key. And the upper voice has the countersubject. Here it is by itself. And here are the subject and the countersubject together. But the first voice, the middle one, still needs something to do, so it gets a second countersubject that goes like this. Notice that at the end of that you hear a fragment of the subject. Bach was a master at getting maximum mileage out of his materials. Keep that in mind because it's going to figure importantly in something I'll get to in just a moment. But first, let's put the subject and this second countersubject together, which gives us this. Now remember that there's that little bit of the subject at the end of the countersubject, which combined with the subject gives a kind of call and response effect. Right there. If you put the 2 countersubjects together, you get this. Now let's put all 3 balls in the air. bottom voice playing the subject, top voice playing the first counter subject, and middle voice playing the second counter subject. This concludes what's called the exposition of the fugue. The subject has been introduced in each of the voices, first the middle one, then the top one, and finally the bottom one. What happens in the remainder of the piece is that the subject gets represented in different voices with episodes between its various occurrences. In this case, the subject is heard next in the top voice, then in the middle voice, then again in the top voice, in the bottom voice, and then one last time in the top voice. So let me play it for you start to finish, and each time the subject comes in, the word subject will appear on the screen along with an indication of which voice it's in. Now, there are all kinds of bells and whistles you can add to a fugue, but the idea, distilled to its essence, is shown by this example. What I'm going to do next is play another one, also from the Well-Tempered Clavier, with a very different character. One of the ways in which this fugue differs from the one we just heard is that it's much slower, grand and imposing, where the earlier one is quick and playful. Another difference is that the one we're about to hear has 4 voices rather than just 3. Now we have music for a whole chorus, as it were, with soprano, alto, tenor, and bass parts. This poses a real challenge to the player, who has only 10 fingers with which to carry all this complexity, but also to the composer, who has to lay the music out in a way that makes it playable in the first place. Let me start by playing you the exposition, in which the subject is heard first in the alto, then in the soprano, then in the tenor, and finally in the bass. Now, a short time ago, I mentioned bells and whistles, things that you can add to a fugue even though they're not required. One of the most common of these is a device called stretto, an Italian word meaning tight, or perhaps more revealingly in this context, compressed. So what exactly is being tightened or compressed? Answer: the time between successive occurrences of the subject. In fact, in a stretto, you compress that time so much that later entries of the subject actually overlap earlier ones. You start a statement of the subject, and the next one is so eager to get into the act that it can't even wait its turn, so to speak, but jumps in before the earlier one has a chance to finish. And this fugue is full of this kind of piling on. Now I'm going to play the piece in its entirety, and as before, you'll see entries of the subject shown on the screen. And all the stretto portions will be indicated visually because new entries will be shown while others are still in progress. Partly because of the use of stretto, this fugue has many more occurrences of its subject than the earlier one does. In the earlier one, the subject occurs 8 times. In this one, you get it more than 20 times. Now, after Bach, we don't find counterpoint playing as large a role in the classical repertoire. In fact, it was already on its way out in Bach's lifetime. He was regarded by many of his contemporaries, to the extent that they knew of him at all, as an old fuddy-duddy clinging doggedly to a musical style that had already gone out of fashion. And yet, it's surprising how often the greatest composers who followed him turned to Bach for inspiration. Mozart did, for example, and so did Beethoven, along with many others. I'm going to finish up by playing something by Mozart that shows the influence of Bach very clearly. This is the first movement of Mozart's last piano sonata. Let me play it for you first, and then I'll talk a little bit about it. Now, this music would never be mistaken for anything by Bach. It clearly comes from a later time, but it's shot through with counterpoint. It has many characteristics of a garden variety sonata movement from the late 18th century, and yet it keeps veering off in a different direction entirely, as if it wants to transform itself into a two-part invention. Let me show you what I mean. The piece starts, as many sonatas of Mozart's time do, with the statement of a theme that doesn't appear to have much going for it, kind of like a hunting horn call. But then suddenly there's a little bit of counterpoint that makes it much more interesting. Then a little later there's a sudden explosion of fireworks. Now, what's going on here? Well, Mozart has given us a canon whose parts are separated by just one note. Here's the right-hand part. And here's the left-hand part. And here they are together. Several more canons show up later. Here's one. Here's another. Now let me play you the whole thing again from start to finish, including the parts I left out. So counterpoint doesn't end with Bach, nor, I might add, is it exclusive to classical music. Lots of early jazz, for example, such as the kind called Dixieland, is filled with counterpoint, and you can even find it here and there in rock and other forms of popular music. So there you have the basics of counterpoint. I hope that you found this helpful and informative. Thanks for watching.